Hey guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am Janine Harry, a communication scientist by profession, here to give you communication tips and self awareness strategies through conversation. So, thank you so much for joining me. And in today's particular YouTube video, I am going to be discussing how to become a more effective listener. So, let's get right into it. Now, there is a misconception that whatever is discussed within the social sciences field is simply general knowledge and it does not need to be learned and taught and so forth. And listening is one such example of something that we think we know how to do. We think it's general knowledge. You will often hear people saying things like, why do I need to learn how to listen? If I've got ears, I can simply listen. The only people who need to learn how to listen are kids. But this cannot be further from the truth because if you have a look at the state of what our society looks like today, you will realize that a lot of issues stem from the fact that somebody has not listened. Okay? If you ask somebody, why is your relationship falling apart? Why have you missed the deadline? Why are you unaware of the deadline? Why is conflict occurring? You will realize that all these dilemmas is a result of ineffective listening skills, and therefore it is so important for us to not just be listeners by default, but to be effective listeners. So let's get right into it. Now, for the scope of this particular YouTube video, I will be discussing hearing versus listening, passive listening versus active listening, and then I'll go on to a broader discussion of the three tips to active listening, namely listening holistically, confirming the accuracy of the message, and finally, paraphrasing. So let's get right into it. Now, it is so important for us to actually make this distinction between hearing versus listening because I'm almost certain that so many people are using these terms, hearing and listening, interchangeably. However, these actually mean two different things, okay? So, for example, hearing is simply perceiving sound entering the ears, and we hear things almost by default, okay? So, for example, when you have background noise in the form of music, people talking, traffic, etc., we hear these things almost by, as I say, default. These are sound that enters our ears. Also, when somebody speaks to you in a language you do not understand, you are simply just hearing them. You might not understand what they are saying, but you can hear their voice, you can hear the sound of their voice, you can hear the exasperation within the tone of their voice. You are simply just hearing them, okay? So, hearing is something, as I said, that we do almost by default, and it's something that we cannot avoid because for as long as we have the ability to physically hear, we are always going to be in the process of hearing whatever sound it is that enters our ears. So, hearing on the one hand is perceiving the sound that enters our ears. Listening, on the other hand, is the ability to assign meaning to what enters the ears. So, for example, if somebody speaks to you in a language that you now understand, you are not simply hearing them speak, you are listening to them speaking. Because, as I said, listening is the ability to understand what somebody is saying. And I always say this quite jokingly. I always tell people, especially people within leadership roles, whether you are an educator, a supervisor, a manager, or even a parent, it's always important to ask yourself, are the people with whom I am communicating to, are they hearing me or are they listening to me? A lot of times you will think that somebody is listening to you because they're looking at you, but they're quite simply just hearing you. Okay? So, hearing and listening are two completely different things, and it is so important for us to be aware of the distinction between the two. It's also important for us to make a distinction between passive listening versus active listening. Now, passive listening is when we allow ourselves to passively absorb information with the aim of understanding without interference. Now, there are many contexts which allow for passive listening. For example, when you go to therapy, or when you go over to your friend to discuss a problem that you're having, simply to vent, it is required that these people with whom we are communicating to simply engage in the act of passive listening. So, passive listening looks like somebody simply just sitting back and listening to what you are saying. They're not saying anything in return, they're not asking any questions, they're doing absolutely nothing. All they are doing is they are sitting back and they are passively listening to you. And as mentioned, passive listening takes place within, contexts such as therapy sessions, even within the church context. When you go to church and you are listening to the sermon being preached by the pastor, when you are sitting in that church pew, you are engaged in the act of passive listening. Okay. Now, active listening, on the other hand, is listening whilst also engaging in active dialogue to negotiate meaning. And this active dialogue will come in the form of asking questions, giving opinions, and so forth. So, active listening happens within contexts such as the educational space, corporate context, and in so much other spaces where active listening is needed because we need to assign meaning to what somebody is saying. Now, there are certain contexts that solely require passive listening, whereby there are other contexts that requires active listening only. But the reality is that we are always in the process of simultaneously passively listening to somebody as well as actively listening to somebody. In fact, we do this both, without even realizing it. And the ability to listen passively and actively within a communicative event happens so fast that in most cases we are unaware of the fact that we have switched over from passive listening to active listening, back to passive listening, and then to active listening. So, passive listening and active listening, and the act of doing so simultaneously, is almost natural. It happens by default. And when we do these two forms of listening, or when we are engaged in the act of doing these two forms of listening together, we can still call it then active listening. So now let's get into those 3 tips to become effective listeners. So, tip number 1, it is so important to listen holistically. And what this means is that you are listening to the whole message. You are able to read between the lines because you are now paying attention to both the verbal and the nonverbal cues present within the communicative event. Now, the reality is that we do not just communicate verbally, we also communicate simultaneously non-verbally. And this non-verbal form of communication comes in the form of facial expressions, dress codes, hand gestures, and so forth, even tone of voice, intonation, etc., and etc. So, communication is both a combination, as I said, of verbal and non-verbal cues. And it is not enough for us to simply just listen to verbal cues only. So, let me give you an example of how this will unfold, specifically how the communicative event of you listening holistically will unfold. Let's say, for example, you are an educator, right? And you go to one of your students and you ask your student, do you understand the work? That student might verbally tell you, and very confidently at that, yes, I understand the work. Okay, so that is what they are saying verbally. However, the non-verbal forms of communication might contradict what they are saying verbally. So even though they are confidently telling you, I understand the work, their facial expression might look quite worrisome. They might give off this energy of anxiety. So it is not enough for you to simply just take somebody's word for it, which is the nonverbal cues, and to be like, okay, fine, I simply believe you. I'm sure that you are okay because you are telling me that you are okay and that you understand the work. You need to go further. When you are observing nonverbal cues and you detect that somebody is not okay after they've actually told you that you are okay, you are now in the position to do more. And by doing more, you can say something like, I hear that you are telling me that you are okay, but I can see that you are not okay. And since I can see that you are not okay, since I can see that you look quite stressed out, what more can I do for you? How can I assist you further? Is there anything else you would like me to do? Okay. So when you are listening holistically to what somebody is saying, you are now in the process of paying attention to both verbal and nonverbal cues. And I can promise you that people are really happy when you are able to listen to the whole message. Because a lot of times within communicative events, we don't feel comfortable enough to communicate, you know, the nonverbal aspects of what we want to say. So, for example, somebody might say, I am okay, because they are not comfortable or confident enough to say that, hey, I'm not okay. But it's usually our nonverbal cues that communicate what we don't want to say. That is the trick right there. It is the nonverbal cues that communicate what somebody doesn't actually want to say. So somebody will say upfront, I'm fine, I understand the work, but they won't necessarily say, I don't understand the work, but it is those nonverbal cues that will inevitably communicate what they don't want to say. And you will find that when you listen to somebody holistically and you are in the process of wanting to do more by saying something like, hey, I hear you when you say that you're not okay, but I see that you're not okay. I can see something's off. People really appreciate that so much. People really appreciate the fact that you are listening to them holistically, that you are able to read between the lines. People really appreciate that intimacy that is created because holistic listening definitely does create intimacy. And intimacy is so beautifully put as into me you see. And into me you see places emphasis on the ways in which we listen to the whole message. We don't just observe somebody on the surface, we observe them in their entirety. And by observing them in their entirety, we are now listening to not just what they are saying verbally, we're paying attention to the whole message, we're paying attention to everything else. We're paying attention to those nonverbal cues as well. Tip number two, it is so important to confirm the accuracy of the message. And confirming the accuracy of the message requires that we ask follow up questions. And follow up questions are asked for the aim of negotiating meaning. And when we're in the process of wanting to negotiate meaning, what we are trying to do is we are trying to understand a message in the exact way it is intended to be understood. Let me give you a little example of this. Let's say, for example, somebody comes to you and says, hey, I'm hungry. Can you get me bread from the store? You might assume that this person simply wants a loaf of bread in which they are going to make themselves a sandwich, and put their own toppings on and so forth. However, if you actually confirm the accuracy of the message by asking follow up questions, you will realize that maybe you did not understand that message in the exact way it was intended to be understood. Because the reality is that because of our diversity, the ways in which we will communicate is different, and with these differences comes the inevitability of misunderstandings. So when you go further and you ask those follow up questions, such as, hey, do you simply just want a loaf of bread by the store, or do you want a sandwich, a ready made sandwich, a ready made tomato and cheese sandwich? The person might say something like, yes, that's exactly what I want. Sorry, I actually want a sandwich, not just a loaf of bread. Can you please get me that ready made sandwich from the deli? So, do you see how asking follow up questions actually allows us to eradicate misunderstandings? It is actually through asking those follow up questions that we are definitely within this space. We are not just assuming that we simply understand or that we are in a perfect position to understand what somebody is saying, but it's getting within this space where we realize that, hey, I might not know exactly what this person is trying to say. I might misunderstand this person, or I might be in the process of misunderstanding this person without even knowing it. So, confirming the accuracy of a message by asking follow up questions is so important because, as I said, it definitely puts us in a perfect position to eradicate the inevitability of misunderstandings that happen within intercultural forms of communication. And the final tip is to paraphrase. And what this means is that I want you to repeat back to someone and flesh out what that person has said in your own words. Okay, I always say that if you can paraphrase what someone has said to you in your own language, you have definitely understood the message. Okay. Now, paraphrasing what somebody has said and confirming the accuracy of the message is quite interlinked. However, through paraphrasing what somebody is saying, you're actually assessing your own ability, you know, in which you're trying to scrutinize yourself and you're trying to figure out, how good of a person or how good of an understanding person are you when it comes to this particular communicative event. So, paraphrasing is so important, Try to repeat what somebody's saying to them in your own words, flesh out what somebody is saying in your own words. And through that, greater understanding will definitely be created within the particular communicative event. Now, if you've gotten this far in the YouTube video, you will realize that listening is not just general knowledge. It's not just something that we can all do by default. However, it is a skill that requires careful understanding and practice at all times. So, yes, let me know what you think of this video. Do you think you are an effective listener or not? Let me know. And I would love to now finally leave you with a quote of wisdom, like I always do. And today's quote comes from Dean Jackson. And he says, listening is an art that requires attention over talent, spirit over ego, others over self. And I absolutely love that. Now, to keep in touch with me, you may subscribe to my YouTube channel. You can follow me on Instagram at Infinia Communications. You can read my blog articles at janineharry90.wordpress.com, or you can email me at janineharry90 at gmail.com. Till next time, much love.